Daya River, 261 BCE. Dawn breaks over a battlefield. But the river isn't flowing with water anymore. It's flowing with blood. Local tradition says the Daya River ran red for days. Whether literal or symbolic, it tells you how Kalinga lived in memory, how the survivors told the story, how the horror became legend. A man walks through this carnage, his royal robes splattered with gore, bodies everywhere, soldiers, farmers, children, monks who tried to stop the fighting. 100,000 dead, 150,000 deported. That's the number he admitted. An entire civilization erased in a single campaign. This man ordered all of it. His name was Ashoka, and in 5 years, he would become the greatest Buddhist king in history. Before we start, I need to tell you what this story is about. This story follows consequences. What you do when you can't undo what you've done. Whether transformation is possible, even when forgiveness isn't. And it starts with his torture chamber. Before Ashoka built monuments across Asia, he built something else. A structure so terrifying that later Buddhist texts called it Ashoka's hell. And the worst part? It was designed to look beautiful from the outside. But let me back up, because you don't understand the torture chamber until you understand how he got the power to build it. 273 BCE, the Mauryan emperor Bindusara dies. Ashoka wasn't supposed to be king. He was one of over 100 sons, but he wanted the throne. What he did next shaped the next 40 years of Asian history. The Ashoka Vedana, a Buddhist Sanskrit text written centuries after Ashoka's death, describes how he killed 99 brothers to claim the throne. Modern historians debate the exact number. Records from that era are incomplete, written by later sources with their own agendas. Whether dozens or less, the evidence is consistent. Systematic family murder. He killed enough that people started calling him Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, before he ever went to war, before he ever commanded an army. This was a man who climbed to power over the bodies of his own blood. Why? His mother was lower caste, in the rigid hierarchy of the Mauryan court. This made him vulnerable, mocked, excluded. His half-brothers with royal mothers looked down on him, reminded him constantly he didn't belong. Every slight became a wound, every wound became rage, and rage became his strategy. He didn't feel like a villain, he felt like a man doing his job, winning, zero empathy, zero mercy, zero remorse. And then, the torture chamber. The Ashokavadana describes it in detail. A building disguised as a beautiful palace, gardens on the outside, screams on the inside. The rule was simple. Anyone who entered could never leave alive, even innocent visitors. Even the architect who built it became its first victim. Did it exist exactly as described? Maybe the Buddhist storytellers who wrote about it centuries later dramatized to teach moral lessons about karma and consequences. But this matters. Whether this specific chamber existed or the truth was less theatrical. Ashoka's reign of terror was real enough to need explaining. His edicts later acknowledge Kalinga in brutal numbers. By the late 260s BCE, Ashoka controlled most of the Indian subcontinent. The Mauryan Empire stretched from Afghanistan to Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Deccan Plateau. Every neighboring kingdom bowed to him. Every rival was crushed. Almost every threat eliminated, except one. A small kingdom on the eastern coast called Kalinga, modern-day Odisha. Rich, independent, proud. They refused to submit. And Ashoka decided to make an example that would echo through history. He did. The thing about cruelty, we want to believe cruel people know they're cruel. That they wake up every morning, look in the mirror, and see a monster staring back. That's fantasy, Ashoka didn't think he was evil. He thought he was strong, effective, doing what emperors do. He thought fear was respect, violence was power, domination was destiny. He was wrong about all three, and 100,000 people would die before he figured that out. Every tyrant has a line, something that finally forces them to look, really look, at what they've become. For Ashoka, it was Kalinga, and they refused to bow. The Kalinga War wasn't the biggest battle in ancient Indian history. It wasn't even close. But it was the bloodiest, and it became the conquest that broke him. Kalinga, Eastern India, a prosperous trading kingdom, access to the Bay of Bengal, control of maritime routes, wealthy from commerce. But more than that, fierce independence, proud warrior culture, a people who valued their freedom above submission. They were the only major kingdom that wasn't under Mauryan control. Ashoka's empire was almost complete, one piece missing, one gap in his total domination. This was about ego. Ashoka didn't need to conquer Kalinga. They weren't a threat. They would have eventually submitted through diplomacy, trade, time, pressure, without violence. But Ashoka wanted total, immediate, unconditional submission. He wanted them to fear him like everyone else did. So he didn't send ambassadors. He sent an army. (261 BCE), 8 years after coronation. Ashoka was in his mid-30s now, at the height of his power. Overwhelming force, war elephants, chariots, infantry in numbers that swallowed the horizon. And the Kalinga people fought back with everything they had. They weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers who picked up spears, fishermen who became archers, families defending their homes, mothers fighting beside sons, old men standing in shield walls, children running messages between defensive positions. They never had a chance. According to Ashoka's own Rock Edict 13, 100,000 died on the battlefield, 150,000 were captured and deported, families torn apart, never to see each other again. But numbers don't tell you what it was like. Entire villages burned to ash, children orphaned by the thousands. Farmers couldn't return to their fields. The land was carpeted with corpses. Accounts describe vultures and crows swarming the battlefield for weeks. The smell of death, they said, carried for miles. And at the end of it all, Ashoka stood victorious. Kalinga was his. Every king in India now feared him. His empire was complete, coast to coast, north to south, total domination. This should have been his greatest triumph. Victory songs echoed across the battlefield. His generals congratulated him. His soldiers celebrated. Fire and wine and the taste of absolute conquest. And then Ashoka did something he had never done before in his entire brutal life. He walked down from his vantage point. He walked into the battlefield and looked directly at the cost. Really see what he had done. Bodies stacked like firewood. A child's hand sticking out from rubble. Families who woke up that morning, eating breakfast, laughing, planning tomorrow, now erased from existence. Victory tasted like ash and blood. And for the first time in his entire life, Ashoka felt something he'd never felt before: recognition. These weren't enemies. They were people, mothers, fathers, children, farmers, fishermen, trying to protect their families, trying to survive. And he had erased them. For what? Pride? A complete empire? To prove he could? They died for one man's need to feel unquestioned. Historical accounts mention a Buddhist monk on that battlefield. Some versions say the monk was wounded, still tending to the dying, even as soldiers celebrated around him. Other accounts say the monk stood silent, surrounded by corpses, staring at Ashoka with eyes that didn't flinch and didn't look away. What the monk said or what Ashoka heard in that silence, we don't know for certain. One chronicle records the question, "Great king, you have won. What have you won?" Another version suggests Ashoka heard those words in his own mind, staring at the carnage. The question rising from somewhere inside him he didn't know existed. Does it matter whether the voice was external or internal? Either way, the question destroyed him. And if you're thinking, how does someone come back from this? Good question, because that's exactly what Ashoka had to answer. Ashoka returned to his capital victorious. He held the celebration, accepted congratulations, distributed rewards to his generals, went through all the expected motions. Everything looked normal from the outside. But inside, something had cracked, and cracks don't heal. They spread. Ashoka didn't become Buddhist overnight. For the first year after Kalinga, he tried to go back to normal, to be the emperor he always was. But you can't unsee what he saw, and you can't unhear that question. What have you won? His later rock edicts mention it. The exact words carved in stone, remorse and mental anguish. We know he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on governance. The faces of Kalinga haunted him. The old woman staring at her dead sons, the child's hand in the rubble, the child's sandal in the mud, the wounded soldier calling for his mother. And what made it worse, he couldn't justify it. He tried. They were rebels. They were independent. Refusing subjugation isn't rebellion. They deserved it. Did children deserve it? Did farmers deserve it? Did monks trying to stop the violence deserve it? All kings wage war. This is what emperors do. Did this war need to happen? Would Kalinga have eventually submitted through diplomacy? Through economic pressure? Through time? Yes. Every justification crumbled. Because he knew the truth, Kalinga would have eventually bent. Trade routes, political marriages, generational change would have brought them into the empire. He chose violence because it was faster, because it fed his ego, because he wanted to prove, one more time, that he was the most powerful man in India. 100,000 people, dead because he couldn't wait. His wife, Devi, had been Buddhist for years. She was from Vidisha, a city he governed before becoming emperor. Some sources say she was a merchant's daughter, lower status than a royal bride, but he married her anyway. While he ignored her faith during his brutal rise to power, after Kalinga, he finally listened. The peace she carried, the same peace he saw in the monks, was already there, in his home. He'd just been too consumed by violence to notice. Buddhist monks had been in his empire for years. He'd barely noticed them, dismissed them as weak, irrelevant, passive. What use were people who owned nothing, who refused to fight, who preached compassion in a world built on conquest? But after Kalinga, their presence felt different. They had something he didn't have. They'd seen suffering. They worked with the poor, the sick, the dying. They walked through the same broken world he ruled. They weren't destroyed by it. They had peace, genuine peace, unshakable, independent of circumstances. How? He started watching them, the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they treated beggars the same as nobles. They didn't seem afraid of him, of death, of anything. And slowly, a thought formed that would have been impossible a year earlier. What if strength wasn't what he thought it was? What if he'd spent his entire life building the wrong empire? Tradition names Upagupta, a Buddhist elder, as one of Ashoka's primary teachers. Another account mentions Moggaliputta Tissa, who would later preside over the Third Buddhist Council. Exactly when Ashoka met them, exactly how the conversations went, the details blur across sources. But the teaching they gave him, that's preserved. Upagupta taught him something that made sense of everything. Buddhism has a diagnosis for what happened to him. The three poisons: greed, hatred, delusion. In Pali, lobha, dosa, moha. Ashoka didn't lose control. He followed the poison and called it power. Greed for empire, for total domination, for proving he was supreme. Hatred toward anyone who challenged him, his brothers, Kalinga, anyone who reminded him of his insecurity. Delusion that violence equals strength, that fear equals respect, that conquest equals victory. The monk asked him, "Your Majesty has conquered the outer world, but can you conquer your inner world?" Ashoka didn't understand. "You defeated Kalinga with weapons and elephants. Can you defeat your own hatred without them? You forced an empire to bow. Can you make your own mind bow to compassion? You proved you can destroy. Can you prove you can build?" And this is where Ashoka's story becomes different from every other tyrant who regretted their crimes. He didn't have a sudden enlightenment. He didn't wake up transformed. He didn't claim the question magically healed him. Instead, he did something harder, something braver. He admitted he didn't know how to stop being who he was, and he asked for help. The emperor who killed his brothers, the king who built a torture chamber, the conqueror who drowned a kingdom in blood. He bowed before Buddhist monks, and he said, "Teach me how to change." He had one advantage over most people who regret things: absolute power. The question was how he would use it. What happened next wasn't a miracle, it was work. 5 years of study, 5 years of meditation, 5 years of confronting on one by one every terrible thing he'd done. This is where Buddhism becomes training. Buddhism doesn't offer easy forgiveness, it offers something harder: understanding why you caused suffering, and choosing deliberately, consciously, never to cause it again. Ashoka didn't reach enlightenment, but he became different. Let me show you how. "5 years of practice, and the difference was everywhere. His transformation showed up as usefulness. Peace became a side effect, taking the same relentless energy he used to destroy, and redirecting it to build. And what he built still stands today, 2,300 years later. First, the name change. Chandashoka became Dhammashoka, a name later tradition gives to Ashoka aligned with the Dhamma. Fierce Ashoka transformed into Ashoka of the Dhamma, a public declaration etched into pillars, distributed across the empire. And then, the edicts. Ashoka did something unprecedented in recorded history. He carved his transformation into stone. This isn't a story written about him. This is him. Carving regret into stone. Rock Edict 13. Ashoka states this himself. 150,000 taken, 100,000 killed, and in his own wording. Many times that number died. Then he says he regrets the conquest, calls it pitiful and grievous. First time in recorded history, a king publicly admitted he was wrong, carved into stone, permanently, for everyone to see, forever. Ashoka's transformation showed up as action. He turned the empire into a construction site, the same energy he used to destroy, redirected to build. Let me show you 3 moments. Scene 1. Care for humans. A traveler walks a dusty road in central India. Midday sun. Exhausted. Then shade. A banyan tree planted by imperial order. Beneath it, a well. A rest house. The traveler drinks, rests, continues his journey. He never met Ashoka, never knew about Kalinga. But Ashoka's transformation kept him alive that day. Ashoka planted thousands of shade trees along every major road in his empire, built rest houses for travelers, dug wells in drought-prone regions, created public water systems. And then, the hospitals. Some of the earliest recorded examples of state-supported care, rest houses, wells, and medical care for people and animals, including the survivors of Kalinga, the people he'd tried to destroy. Scene 2. Care for animals. A deer with a broken leg stumbles into a clearing. Normally, it dies. But there's a building here now, one of Ashoka's animal care facilities, among the first documented in recorded history. Someone tends to it. This is ahimsa, non-harm as empire policy. Ashoka banned animal sacrifice, massive deal in a culture built on ritual offerings to gods. Brahmin priests opposed him, called him heretical. He did it anyway. The guy who loved royal hunts, who probably killed hundreds of animals for sport, made it his mission to protect wildlife, created sanctuaries, protected forests, banned hunting in certain regions. He reduced meat consumption in his own palace, didn't force vegetarianism on others, but led by example. The royal kitchen that once served dozens of meat dishes daily, cut down to 2. Scene 3. Care for the future. A ship arrives on the Sri Lankan coast, 240 BCE. A woman steps off, Princess Sangamita, Ashoka's daughter. In her hands, a cutting from the Bodhi tree, the actual tree the Buddha sat under during enlightenment. She plants it in Anuradhapura. That tree is still alive, over 2,300 years later. The Jaya Sri Mahabodhi, one of the oldest living trees with a recorded planting date. You can visit it today, touch the same species of tree, descended from the same roots that the Buddha sat beneath. That tree outlived Ashoka's empire, outlived his name, and it's still there. Ashoka sent missionaries across Asia. He sent teachers, people with robes, texts, a message that didn't need an army. His son Mahinda volunteered for the mission to Sri Lanka alongside his sister. Imagine that conversation. Children of the man who once killed family members for power, now willingly leaving the empire to spread a message of peace. That's transformation, witnessed by the people who knew him best. Before Ashoka, Buddhism was a regional Indian religion, a small movement, a few monasteries. After Ashoka, Buddhism reached Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Central Asia, eventually China, Korea, Japan. Through invitation, through teaching, through example. Generals who'd built careers on conquest suddenly found themselves obsolete. Brahmin priests lost income from animal sacrifices. Court advisors questioned whether compassion could hold an empire together. Ashoka faced opposition, but he held firm. And Kalinga? The kingdom he destroyed? He poured resources back into rebuilding it, built hospitals in the same cities he'd burned, planted trees along the same roads his army marched, dug wells in the same fields where corpses rotted. The dead were beyond his reach, the living still needed care. He gave it. But let's be honest. Ashoka didn't become perfect, didn't become a saint, didn't reach enlightenment. He was still an emperor, still held absolute power, still made compromises, still governed through authority. He reduced violence, he promoted compassion, but he still ruled an empire built on his father's and grandfather's conquests. He never became a monk. He married, had children, made political decisions. His edicts don't claim enlightenment. They read like someone who's still figuring it out. I might be wrong about some of these policies. Please tell me if I make mistakes. I'm doing my best, but I'm still learning. That's the language of someone genuinely trying to be better. Truth is, trying is closer to real life than sainthood, because saints feel unreachable, perfect, beyond us. But trying, failing sometimes, getting back up, we can all do that. We talk a lot about making amends, but what does that actually mean? Ashoka shows us It's about repair. He couldn't bring back the dead, he knew that. His transformation didn't erase his crimes, didn't balance any cosmic scales. But it did this. It stopped the killing. It redirected imperial resources from conquest to care. It created infrastructure that outlived his empire by centuries. The Buddha said, and this line is simple, hatred never ends through hatred, only through non-hatred. Ashoka took that seriously. He didn't spend decades feeling bad about Kalinga. He spent decades responding to it. You know what I find most powerful? Ashoka never stopped carrying Kalinga with him. His edicts mention it decades later. Rock Edict 13 was carved late in his reign, maybe 20 years after the war. He never forgave himself, never moved on. He didn't get a clean conscience. He got a direction. I think that's Buddhist. Because Buddhism doesn't teach you to forget your mistakes. It teaches you to remember them so clearly that you never repeat them. Ashoka's guilt didn't paralyze him. It powered him. Every monument he built, and Buddhist tradition says he built thousands, whether that number is literal or symbolic, it tells you the scale was a refusal to forget. Every edict he carved was a promise to do better, because it was the right thing to do. Ashoka ruled for 37 years after Kalinga. He died in 232 BCE, around age 70. His empire collapsed 50 years later. Dynasties always fall, power always fades. But his legacy? That's still growing. Walk through India today, Sri Lanka, Nepal. Anywhere Buddhism touched, you'll find Ashoka, proof that one person's transformation can echo for 2,300 years. His pillars stand after all this time, legible, teaching. The Ashoka Chakra, the 24-spoke wheel on his pillars, is on India's national flag today. His lion capital is India's national emblem, on every government document, every official seal. The Bodhi tree his daughter planted lives in Sri Lanka. Pilgrims travel thousands of miles to see it. Buddhism in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, all trace their lineage back to Ashoka's missionaries. Ashoka was the first emperor to publicly renounce war. He created the concept of Dhamma, universal moral law, something beyond any single religion, a code of compassion applicable to everyone, Buddhist or Hindu, Greek or Macedonian, believer or skeptic. His edicts refer to the Yonas, Greeks, showing how diverse his world already was, and they argue for tolerance across cultures and faiths. He promoted the idea, radical for ancient times, that a ruler's duty is to care for subjects. Care for them. Later rulers drew inspiration. Kanishka of the Kushan Empire, Harsha of northern India. Centuries later, Akbar the Great. Around 250 BCE, Ashoka convened a great Buddhist council, the third major gathering of Buddhist elders since the Buddha's death. Buddhist elders from across his empire gathered in Pataliputra. They compiled teachings, resolved disputes, prepared texts for the missionaries about to spread across Asia. Moggaliputta Tissa presided. Ashoka didn't just support Buddhism, he helped organize it. The Daya River runs clear now. The blood washed away centuries ago. The battlefield is farmland. The dead are dust. Violence echoes, but so does compassion. Ashoka chose which echo he wanted to leave. The question Ashoka's story forces us to answer. Ask the question that changes tomorrow. What do you do when you can't undo what you've done? Make it personal. Have you ever said something you can't take back? Done something that permanently hurt someone? Made a choice that can't be unmade? Become someone you hate when you look back? Ashoka murdered family members. You probably didn't. But the question is the same. What do you do when you can't undo it? When sorry isn't enough? When you have to live with the weight? Buddhism doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't say forgive yourself and move on. It doesn't promise that good deeds erase bad ones. It offers something harder. Ashoka's path had 4 stages, and you can follow them too. Stage 1. Recognition. See clearly what you did. Don't minimize it. Don't justify it. Ashoka walked that battlefield and really looked. Stage 2. Responsibility. Own it completely. No excuses. His edicts didn't blame Kalinga for resisting. He admitted, this was my choice, my fault, my consequences. Stage 3. Repair. Do what you can to fix it. The dead are beyond reach. Future deaths can be prevented. Maybe it's texting someone you hurt. I was wrong. How can I make this right? Maybe it's changing a pattern. One action. Stage 4. Renewal. Choose someone new. You can't erase who you were, you can't delete the past, but you can refuse to be that person again. Chandashoka became Dhammashoka. The name change mattered, because the change was real. One choice, to be different. That's the path Ashoka took. Not easy, not perfect, but real. We've talked about enlightenment on this channel. The Buddha's discovery. The path. Enlightenment isn't perfection, it's practice. We covered Milarepa, another killer who transformed, another man who carried his guilt into wisdom. We explored Jung and the shadow. You don't erase your darkness, you integrate it. We dove into death in Buddhism. Your actions echo beyond your lifetime. Ashoka couldn't bring back the 100,000 people killed at Kalinga. He knew that. His transformation didn't balance the scales, didn't erase his crimes, didn't earn him enlightenment. But it did this. It stopped the killing. It spread compassion instead of conquest. It transformed a legacy of violence into a legacy of care. Somewhere under the soil of that old battlefield, a child's sandal was buried. Ashoka couldn't undo that, so he spent the rest of his life trying to make sure fewer sandals got left behind. The river of blood eventually washed away, but the monuments he built, still standing. The tree his daughter planted, still growing. The ideas he spread, still changing lives. Violence echoes. But so does compassion. Ashoka chose which echo he wanted to leave. So can you. If this story hit you, drop a comment about one thing you want to change about yourself. One habit, one reaction, one pattern. Because transformation starts with one honest admission. I can be better. And if you need a reminder of that, Buddhism has been teaching it for 2,500 years. Ashoka proved it's possible even after the worst acts, which means it's possible for you too. Until then, remember what Ashoka's story teaches. It's never too late to become who you wish you'd always been, but it's also never easy. And it's never finished. Stay curious. Stay wise.